London before it was London. The Anglo-Saxon cities stand on London Bridge today and look toward the city of London. You'll see the Gherkin, the Shard, the towers of global finance rising above the Thames. 8 million people live in Greater London. The city sprawls for miles in every direction, a megacity that defines modern Britain. But if you stood on this exact spot 1,000 years ago, in the year 1025 AD, you wouldn't see skyscrapers or concrete. You wouldn't see Big Ben or Westminster Abbey. You wouldn't even hear English as we know it. You'd be standing on a wooden bridge, looking at a city of timber buildings and thatched roofs, enclosed by ancient Roman walls that had been rebuilt after centuries of decay. The population was perhaps 12,000 people, a fraction of a percent of today's London. The language spoken was Old English, incomprehensible to modern ears. And the king ruling the city wasn't English at all, he was Danish. This is London in 1025 AD, during the reign of Cnut the Great, when the city was a trading port on the edge of a Danish North Sea empire, still recovering from decades of Viking invasions, and barely recognizable as the London we know today. The ghost of Roman Londinium. To understand London in 1025 AD, you must first understand what it had been, and what had been lost. Roman Londinium, founded around 47 AD, had been a thriving provincial capital with perhaps 60,000 inhabitants at its peak in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Romans built walls enclosing roughly 330 acres, constructed a bridge across the Thames, paved streets, erected public baths, temples, an amphitheater, and a governor's palace. It was a planned, organized Roman city, but by the early 5th century, Roman Britain had collapsed. The legions withdrew around 410 AD. The economic and political systems that sustained Londinium disintegrated. The population fled or died. The city was abandoned. For nearly 2 centuries, the old Roman city stood empty, a ghost town of crumbling walls, collapsed roofs, and overgrown streets. Archaeological evidence shows virtually no occupation within the Roman walls, from approximately 450 to 650 AD. This period is sometimes called the Dark Earth phenomenon, because archaeological layers from these centuries contain dark soil with almost no artifacts or building remains. The Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples who migrated to Britain starting in the 5th century, initially avoided the Roman ruins. They preferred to settle in rural areas, building wooden halls and farming settlements. To the Anglo-Saxons, the Roman ruins were eerie, possibly haunted remnants of a lost civilization they didn't understand. Eventually, around 600–700 AD, the Anglo-Saxons established a new settlement called Lundenburh, located about a mile west of the abandoned Roman city, in the area now known as Covent Garden and the Strand. This was a trading settlement. Wick means trading place focused on commerce rather than fortification. But Viking raids in the 9th century changed everything. In 842 and 851 AD, Viking fleets attacked and burned Lundenburh. The exposed riverside trading settlement was indefensible. So around 886 AD, King Alfred the Great of Wessex reconquered London from Danish Vikings and made a crucial decision. He moved the settlement back inside the old Roman walls, creating what was now called Lundenburh Fort. By 1025 AD, London had been re-established within the Roman walls for nearly 140 years, but it was a medieval city built inside ancient Roman bones. Geography and city layout. London in 1025 AD occupied the same roughly square mile area enclosed by the Roman walls, the area still known today as the City of London or the Square Mile. The Thames was wider and shallower than today, with marshy banks and tidal mudflats. The river was not embanked, so its edges shifted with the tides. The northern bank, where the city stood, was firmer ground rising gently from the waterfront. London Bridge was the only crossing point. The bridge in 1025 AD was a wooden structure, probably built on the foundations of earlier Roman and Saxon bridges. It connected the city to Southwark on the southern bank. The bridge was narrow, designed for foot traffic and carts, with wooden planks and pilings driven into the riverbed. Maintenance was constant, as floods and ice regularly damaged it. The Roman walls still defined the city's perimeter. These stone walls, built in the 3rd century, had been repaired and reinforced under Alfred and his successors. They stood roughly 15 to 20 feet high in most places, with defensive towers at intervals. Several gates provided access: Ludgate to the west, Newgate to the northwest, Aldersgate and Cripplegate to the north, Bishopsgate to the northeast, and Aldgate to the east. A water gate called Billingsgate provided access to the Thames waterfront. Inside the walls, the city was not densely packed. Large sections remained open space: gardens, orchards, and fields. The population of perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 people left much of the 330-acre area underutilized. Residential and commercial buildings clustered along main streets and near the waterfront, but much of the interior was agricultural or empty. The street plan partially followed old Roman roads, though many had been built over or altered. The main east-west route ran from Ludgate in the west toward Aldgate in the east, roughly following the old Roman road. North-south routes connected the gates to the waterfront, but the street network was less regular than in Roman times. Narrow lanes and alleys branched off main routes, creating an organic medieval pattern. Architecture and building materials. London in 1025 AD was overwhelmingly a city of wood. The vast majority of buildings were timber-framed structures. Oak was the primary building material, used for structural posts and beams. Walls were constructed using wattle and daub, a lattice of woven wooden strips. Wattle covered with a mixture of clay, soil, straw, and animal dung daub, then sometimes plastered over with lime plaster. Roofs were thatched with straw or reed, steeply pitched to shed rain. Wooden shingles were used on some wealthier buildings. These roofs were highly flammable, and fires were a constant danger in the densely built areas. Most houses were single-story or had a single upper floor. They were small by modern standards, perhaps 20 to 30 feet long and 12 to 15 feet wide for a typical craftsman's home. Floors were packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. Hearths were central features, usually just an open fire pit in the middle of the room with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or under the eaves. Chimneys were rare. Windows were small openings, often covered with wooden shutters. Glass was extremely rare and expensive, found only in churches. Most homes had minimal natural light once shutters were closed. The exceptions to this wooden architecture were churches, which were built of stone. The most important was St. Paul's Cathedral, which stood on Ludgate Hill, the highest point in the city. The cathedral that existed in 1025 AD was not the current St. Paul's that was built after the Great Fire of 1666. The Saxon St. Paul's was a stone church, probably built in the 7th century and rebuilt or expanded multiple times. It had a wooden roof, thick stone walls, narrow windows, and a tower. Inside, it was dark, lit by candles and oil lamps, with wall paintings and religious artifacts. Other stone churches included All Hallows by the Tower, founded around 675 AD, and several smaller parish churches. By 1025 AD, London had perhaps a dozen to 20 churches, most serving small neighborhoods or specific communities. Some buildings incorporated Roman materials. Stones from collapsed Roman structures were reused in church foundations and walls. The Romans had left a quarry's worth of cut stone, and medieval builders took advantage of it. The Roman amphitheater, forum, and public baths had long since disappeared, their stones robbed for new construction. Only fragments remained buried beneath medieval streets. Population and social structure. The population of London in 1025 AD is estimated at between 10,000 and 15,000 people, making it one of the larger towns in England, though far smaller than major continental cities like Constantinople, Rhoda, or even Paris. At the top of the social hierarchy was the king. In 1025 AD, this was Cnut the Great, who had conquered England in 1016 and ruled until 1035. Cnut was king of England, Denmark, and Norway. He controlled a North Sea empire. He spent time in England, including London, which was an important administrative and economic center of his realm. Below the king were the earls and thanes, Anglo-Saxon nobles who held land, commanded military forces, and administered justice. These men lived in larger timber halls within or near the city, though many maintained country estates as well. They owed military service to the king and collected rents from lands they controlled. The church hierarchy was separate but intertwined with secular power. The Bishop of London was an important figure, overseeing the cathedral and the city's religious life. Monasteries and religious communities operated within the city, though London was primarily a commercial center, not a monastic one. The bulk of the population consisted of free craftsmen, merchants, and traders. London's economy was based on commerce, and these middle-status individuals formed the backbone of urban life. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, butchers, leatherworkers, weavers, and potters worked in small workshops. Merchants engaged in trade, importing goods from Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France, and the Rhineland, and exporting English wool, tin, and grain. Below them were laborers and the poor people who worked for wages, had no land or trade, and lived on the margins of subsistence. Poverty was common, and life expectancy was short. Slaves existed in Anglo-Saxon England, though slavery was gradually declining under Christian influence. Slaves were typically war captives or people sold into bondage due to debt or crime. They had no legal rights and worked as domestic servants or agricultural laborers. Women's status varied by class. Noble women could own property and had some legal protections. Merchant and craftsmen's wives often assisted in family businesses. Poor women worked as servants, laundresses, or alemakers. Marriage was economically and socially important, arranged to consolidate property and alliances. Daily life in 1025 at London. Daily life in London in 1025 revolved around work, survival, and the rhythms of the church calendar. Most people woke at dawn. Artificial light was expensive candles made from tallow or beeswax, oil lamps fueled with fish oil or animal fat, so activities followed the sun. Breakfast, if eaten, was bread and ale. Water from the Thames or wells was unsafe to drink, so weak ale was the standard beverage for everyone, including children. The main meal was eaten around midday and consisted of bread, pottage, a thick soup or stew made from barley, oats, vegetables, and occasionally meat, onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans. Meat, pork, mutton, or chicken was eaten occasionally, more frequently by the wealthy. Fish from the Thames or brought from coastal markets was more common. Dairy products, cheese, and butter supplemented diets. The wealthy ate better. White bread made from wheat, roasted meats, game birds, imported wine, honey, and spices. Feasting on holy days and special occasions was an important social ritual. Work dominated daily existence. Craftsmen labored in workshops attached to their homes. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and nails. Carpenters built and repaired buildings and boats. Potters made vessels. Weavers produced woolen cloth. Leather workers crafted shoes, belts, and harnesses. Women managed households, a labor-intensive job involving cooking, brewing ale, spinning wool, weaving cloth, preserving food, and caring for children. Many women also worked in markets, selling produce or prepared foods. Some operated alehouses or worked as midwives. Children worked from a young age, helping with household chores, tending animals, running errands, or apprenticing in trades. Formal education was rare, limited to church schools that taught Latin to boys training for the priesthood or administrative work. Sanitation was rudimentary. There was no sewage system. Waste was thrown into street gutters or into pits in backyards, which were periodically emptied. Latrines overhung the Thames or drained into cesspits. The smell of human and animal waste, smoke from cooking fires, tanning operations, and rotting organic matter would have been pervasive. Hygiene was minimal by modern standards. Most people never bathed in the full immersion sense. Washing hands and faces in basins was common, but full body washing was rare. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were universal. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other illnesses killed many, especially children. Entertainment was simple. Religious festivals provided breaks from labor, with processions, feasting, and sometimes mystery plays performed by guilds. Alehouses were social centers where men drank, gambled with dice, and shared news. Storytelling, oral recitation of heroic poems and sagas was a valued skill. Music from simple instruments like harps, flutes, and drums accompanied gatherings. Trade and economy. London in 1025 AD was, above all, trading city. Its location on the Thames, accessible to seagoing ships, made it a natural hub for commerce. The waterfront was the economic heart of the city. Wooden wharves and docks lined the Thames, where ships from across northern Europe unloaded cargo. Billingsgate, originally a water gate in the Roman walls, had become the primary dock and fish market. Ships brought timber from Scandinavia, wine from France, pottery from the Rhineland, cloth from Flanders, and fish from North Sea fisheries. England exported wool, tin from Cornwall, grain, and slaves. Wool was particularly important. English sheep produced high-quality fleeces that were in demand across Europe. Merchants in London acted as middlemen, buying wool from rural estates and selling it to continental traders. Markets operated in open spaces within the city. Cheapside, which means Market Street, was a major commercial area. Craftsmen's workshops lined the streets, with goods displayed in front. Specialized markets existed for different products: fish at Billingsgate, livestock outside the walls, bread and grain in designated areas. Coinage was in circulation. The Anglo-Saxon penny was the standard silver coin. King Cnut maintained royal control over minting, with moneyers in London and other towns producing coins stamped with the king's image and name. Coins facilitated trade, though barter remained common, especially among the poor. The guild system was developing, though it was less formalized than it would become in later medieval centuries. Craftsmen organized into associations to regulate quality, protect trade secrets, and provide mutual support. These proto-guilds were the ancestors of the powerful medieval guilds that would dominate London's economy in later centuries. Trade brought wealth, but also risk. Merchant ships faced storms, pirates, and political instability. Wars and political changes could disrupt trade routes, but the rewards for successful merchants were substantial wealth, property, and social status. Religion and the Church. England in 1025 AD was a Christian kingdom, and religion permeated daily life in London. Christianity had been reintroduced to Anglo-Saxon England by missionary efforts beginning in the late 6th century. St. Augustine of Canterbury arrived in 597 AD, sent by Pope Gregory I, and established the See of Canterbury. London received its own bishop around the same time, making St. Paul's Cathedral the center of ecclesiastical authority in the city. By 1025 AD, Christianity was deeply embedded in English society. Pagan practices had been suppressed, though some folk traditions with pre-Christian origins persisted in rural areas. Church bells marked the hours of the day, calling the faithful to prayer. Most people attended Mass on Sundays and holy days. Services were conducted in Latin, which the vast majority of the population did not understand. Participation was passive. Congregants stood or knelt while priests performed the liturgy. Preaching was rare. The Mass was ritualistic, focused on the sacraments rather than scriptural education. The church calendar structured the year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and saints' feast days were marked by special services, processions, and feasting. Fasting periods like Lent were observed, at least nominally, with restrictions on meat consumption. Churches were community centers as much as places of worship. They provided sanctuary for criminals fleeing justice, offered charity to the poor, and served as gathering places for announcements and communal decisions. Monasteries and religious houses operated within and around London. Monks and nuns lived according to rules that prescribed prayer, work, and study. Monasteries preserved literacy, copying manuscripts and maintaining libraries. They also owned extensive lands and engaged in agriculture and commerce. However, the church was also deeply political. Bishops and abbots were appointed by the king, and often came from noble families. They wielded temporal power, collecting tithes of agricultural production, owning property, and influencing royal policy. The line between spiritual and secular authority was blurred. Relics, bones, or belongings of saints were venerated and believed to possess miraculous powers. Churches competed to acquire relics, which attracted pilgrims and donations. The cult of saints was central to medieval Christianity, offering intercessors who could petition God on behalf of the faithful. Political control under Cnut in 1025 AD. London was part of the Kingdom of England, but that kingdom was ruled by a Danish conqueror. Cnut the Great had invaded England in 1015 with a massive Viking army. By 1016, he had defeated the English King Edmund Ironside and taken control of the entire kingdom. Cnut then consolidated his rule by marrying Emma of Normandy, the widow of the previous English king, Thelred the Unready, thereby legitimizing his claim to the throne. Cnut ruled England from 1016 to 1035, and he also became King of Denmark 1018 and Norway 1028, creating a North Sea empire. He was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe during his reign. Despite being a foreign conqueror, Cnut governed England relatively effectively. He maintained many Anglo-Saxon laws and customs, patronized the church, and integrated English nobles into his administration alongside Danish and Norse followers. He issued law codes, minted coins, and promoted trade. London was one of Cnut's key power centers. The city was wealthy, strategically located, and had a significant population. Cnut held court in London periodically, though he also spent time in Winchester, the traditional capital of Wessex, and in his Scandinavian kingdoms. The administration of London involved a royal reeve, an official appointed by the king to collect taxes, enforce laws, and manage royal properties. The city also had a court system based on Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, where free men could bring disputes for judgment. Justice was harsh and public. Crimes like theft, assault, and murder were punished with fines, wargled blood money paid to victims or their families, physical mutilation, cutting off hands or ears, or execution by hanging. Trial by ordeal, testing guilt by subjecting the accused to painful or dangerous tests, was still practiced, though it was beginning to decline. Political loyalty was personal, based on oaths between lord and follower. Nobles and warriors swore oaths to the king, promising military service in exchange for land, protection, and rewards. This bond was sacred, and breaking an oath was one of the worst offenses in Anglo-Saxon society. Defense and fortifications. London in 1025 AD was a fortified city, and its defenses reflected decades of Viking threats. The Roman walls were the primary defensive structure. These stone walls, repaired and reinforced under Alfred the Great and his successors, enclosed the entire city. They were roughly 15 to 20 feet high and 6 to 9 feet thick at the base. Defensive towers projected from the walls at intervals, providing positions for archers and defenders to repel attackers. The gates were the most vulnerable points. Each gate was fortified with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, guard towers on either side, and portcullises that could be lowered to block entry. Guards manned the gates, controlling who entered and exited the city. A ditch or moat ran along the outside of the northern walls in some sections, providing an additional obstacle to attackers. London Bridge was both a vital link and a defensive choke point. If enemies approached from the south, the bridge could be defended or even partially dismantled to prevent crossing. The military forces available to defend London consisted of the Fyrd, a militia of free men who owed military service. Every able-bodied freeman was expected to serve in the Fyrd when called upon by the king or local lord. The Fyrd was not a professional army, but a part-time force of farmers and craftsmen who fought when needed. Weapons included spears, axes, swords, and shields. Spears were the most common weapon, cheap to make and effective in formation fighting. Axes were favored by Vikings and some Anglo-Saxons. Swords were expensive and owned primarily by nobles and professional warriors. Armor was rare. Most fighters wore leather or padded cloth, perhaps a helmet. Mail shirts were luxury items reserved for the elite. The king also maintained a personal bodyguard of professional warriors, the housecarls. These men were well-equipped, experienced fighters who formed the core of any army. In Cnut's case, many of his housecarls were Danish Vikings, loyal to him personally, London had not faced a major siege in several decades by 1025 AD. The Viking invasions of the late 10th and early 11th centuries had caused widespread destruction, but Cnut's conquest had brought relative stability. The city's defenses remained important, but they were not actively tested during Cnut's reign. From timber town to global city, the London of 1025 at a timber city of 12,000 people, ruled by a Danish king, enclosed by ancient Roman walls, was unrecognizable compared to the London we know today. It was not a capital in the modern sense. Winchester held equal or greater political importance. It was not culturally dominant. Most of England was rural, and London's influence extended only to its immediate region and trade networks. But this small Anglo-Saxon trading town contained the seeds of future greatness. Its location on the Thames made it an inevitable commercial hub. The re-establishment within the Roman walls created a defensible urban core, and the political turbulence of the era of Viking invasions, Danish conquest, eventual Norman Conquest in 1066 forced London to adapt, fortify, and grow. Just 41 years after 1025 AD, William the Conqueror would seize England at the Battle of Hastings. He would build the Tower of London to control the city. The Normans would bring stone architecture, feudalism, and continental connections that would transform England and London forever. By 1100 AD, London was already growing beyond its walls. By 1300 AD, it would be one of Europe's great cities, with a population exceeding 80,000. The medieval city would burn in the Great Fire of 1666, be rebuilt, survive the Blitz, and become the sprawling metropolis of 8 million people it is today. But in 1025 AD, none of that was certain. London was a timber town on the edge of a Danish empire, a trading post built inside Roman ruins, where Old English-speaking merchants sold wool to Viking sailors and Anglo-Saxon thanes swore oaths to a Scandinavian king. Walking through the city of London today past glass towers and concrete, it's almost impossible to imagine the wooden bridge, the thatched roofs, the smoke-filled halls, and the muddy lanes that existed 1,000 years ago, but that London, small, wooden, vulnerable, and resilient, was where it all began. Before it was London, before it was a capital, before it was a global city, it was Lundenburh, a fortified Anglo-Saxon trading town trying to survive in a dangerous, changing world. And from that timber town, across 1,000 years of fire, plague, war, and transformation, rose the London we know today.